For 400 years, the voice of God went silent. No prophets, no miracles, no divine messages recorded anywhere in the ancient world. The same God who had spoken through burning bushes, through earthquakes, through the thunder at Mount Sinai, simply stopped. And an entire civilization was left waiting. Not for a decade, not for a generation, for 400 years. Roughly the same span of time that separates us from the Pilgrim's Landing at Plymouth Rock. 4 centuries of silence so total, so heavy, so theologically disorienting that historians have given it its own name, the intertestamental period. The years between the Old Testament and the New. The years when, by every available measure, heaven was closed. This is the story of those 400 years. What happened during them? What empires rose and fell while an entire people waited? What it did to their faith, their identity, and their hope. And what it might mean even now for anyone who has ever prayed into silence and heard nothing back. To understand the silence, you first need to understand what preceded it. For centuries, the nation of Israel had lived within a framework unlike anything else in the ancient world. Their entire national identity was built around a direct relationship with a God who spoke, not metaphorically, not through vague spiritual impressions, literally spoke. Through prophets, through visions, through fire and earthquake, and the still small voice that came to Elijah after the storm had passed. The Hebrew prophets were not peripheral figures in Israelite society. They were its most powerful voices, men and women who claimed to receive direct messages from God and deliver them to kings, priests, and ordinary people without apology. Isaiah described a servant who would bear the sins of many. Jeremiah wept over a nation he loved and could not save. Ezekiel saw visions so strange and overwhelming they seem almost impossible to describe. Daniel interpreted the dreams of foreign kings in foreign courts. These were not quiet mystics. They were thunderous public forces who shaped the fate of nations. And then, around 430 BCE, a prophet named Malachi delivered what would become the last recorded divine message in the Hebrew Bible. His message was not gentle. He rebuked the priests for offering defective sacrifices. He condemned the people for going through the motions of religion without genuine devotion behind it. But buried inside the rebuke was a promise that one day, a figure like the prophet Elijah would return, preparing the way for something far greater. And then the voice stopped. The Hebrew Bible ends there. No further prophets are recorded. No further divine communications are preserved. The canon closes, and the silence begins. To appreciate the psychological weight of what followed, you have to set aside the comfortable distance of historical hindsight. We know how the story ends. The people living through those 400 years did not. They were waiting for something. Their own scriptures told them to. The prophets had spoken of a coming Messiah, the Hebrew word meaning anointed one, a figure who would restore the kingdom of David, deliver Israel from its enemies, and usher in an age of justice and peace. Some expected a warrior king who would drive out the foreign occupiers by force. Some expected a priestly figure who would purify the religious institutions of the nation. Some expected something entirely outside any category they could name. What they did not expect was 400 years of silence. Yet silence is what they received. Imagine being born into that waiting. Your grandparents waited. Your parents waited. You grow up saturated in the stories of a God who acted, who split the Red Sea, who fed the Israelites in the desert, who brought water from a rock and fire from the sky. You know these stories. You recite them at festivals. You teach them to your children. And yet nothing new comes. No prophet stands in the marketplace and declares that God has spoken. No miracle interrupts the ordinary suffering of ordinary life. The heavens, by every available measure, are sealed. What do you do with that? What do you do with a promise that never seems to arrive? Here is what is not in question, because history records it clearly. The world, during those 400 years, did not stand still. The intertestamental period was one of the most turbulent and transformative eras in ancient history. Empires rose and collapsed with terrifying speed. The Jewish people, a small nation without a king, geographically trapped between competing superpowers, were caught in the grinding machinery of one conquest after another. And every time the political situation seemed like it could not possibly worsen, it did. When Malachi wrote his final words, the Jewish people were already living under foreign domination. The Persian Empire controlled the region of Judah. Persian rule, by the brutal standards of the ancient world, was relatively tolerant. The Persians generally allowed conquered peoples to practice their own religions and maintain their own cultural institutions. It was under Persian authorization that the Jewish exiles had returned from Babylon, rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem, and re-established a functioning religious community. The priest Ezra had led a spiritual renewal. The governor Nehemiah had overseen the reconstruction of Jerusalem's walls. The Jewish community at the dawn of the silent years was, in some ways, recovering, battered, but intact. Then everything changed. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed into Persian territory with an army that moved faster and fought harder than anything the ancient world had seen. His name was Alexander, and within a decade he had dismantled the Persian Empire entirely. By 332 BCE, his forces had swept through the Levant and taken Egypt. The region we now call Israel fell under Greek control with almost no resistance. The real disruption was not military, it was cultural. Alexander and his successors were committed to a project called Hellenization, the systematic spread of Greek language, philosophy, architecture, and worldview across the conquered world. Greek became the language of commerce and education. Greek cities, with their gymnasiums and theaters and public baths, rose across the landscape. Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics began seeping into the intellectual world of Jewish scribes and scholars. For the Jewish community, this created a crisis that would define the next 2 centuries. How do you maintain the identity of a people defined by their separation from surrounding cultures by dietary laws, ritual observance, and a singular devotion to one invisible God, when the surrounding culture is everywhere, sophisticated, and increasingly impossible to ignore? Some Jewish aristocrats embraced Hellenization enthusiastically. They built gymnasiums in Jerusalem. They adopted Greek names and Greek clothing and moved through Greek social circles. Others recoiled in horror. The tension between these two groups would eventually boil over into one of the most dramatic conflicts of the silent years. When Alexander died suddenly in 303 BCE at the age of 32, his empire fractured among his generals. The Jewish homeland ended up caught between 2 successor kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt to the south, and the Seleucids in Syria to the north. For roughly a century, the Ptolemies controlled Judah. Conditions were relatively stable. Jewish scholars in Alexandria produced the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that would later become the Bible of the early Christian church. Then the Seleucids moved south. In 98 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus III defeated the Ptolemies and took control of Judah. At first, conditions remained manageable. Then his son came to power. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, his very name a declaration of arrogance, meaning God manifest, became one of the most catastrophic figures in Jewish history. In 67 BCE, he moved against Jerusalem with a ferocity that shook the Jewish world to its foundations. He looted the temple treasury. He banned the practice of Judaism, including Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and circumcision on pain of death. He ordered the execution of Jews found in possession of copies of the Torah. And then he did the unthinkable. He desecrated the temple itself. He erected an altar to Zeus, the chief deity of the Greek pantheon, inside the sacred sanctuary. And according to ancient sources, he sacrificed a pig on the altar of burnt offerings. In Jewish religious thought, there is virtually no act more profoundly offensive than this. The temple was not merely a religious building. It was the dwelling place of the divine presence itself. To defile it was not political aggression. It was a direct assault on the relationship between God and Israel. Biblical scholars note that this event is likely referenced in the book of Daniel as the abomination of desolation, though the precise interpretation of that phrase has been debated across centuries. What is not debated is the Jewish response. In a small town called Modiin, a priest named Mattathias refused to comply with Antiochus's orders. When another Jewish man stepped forward to offer a pagan sacrifice in Mattathias's place, Mattathias killed him on the spot and then killed the royal official who had given the order. He and his sons fled to the Judean wilderness. What followed was a guerrilla war of extraordinary resilience. After Mattathias died, his son Judas nicknamed Maccabeus, meaning the hammer, led a band of fighters against the vastly superior Seleucid forces through a series of stunning military victories. By 64 BCE, exactly 3 years after the temple's desecration, Judas Maccabeus had retaken Jerusalem. He purified and rededicated the temple. The celebration of that rededication, known as Hanukkah, is still observed in Jewish communities across the world today. For a time, the Jewish people had something they had not known in centuries: an independent state, governed by the Hasmonean dynasty, descendants of Mattathias himself. It would not last. Rome had been watching. By the 1st century BCE, Rome was the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey swept into the Middle East. The Hasmonean dynasty, weakened by an internal civil war between two brothers fighting each other for control of Jerusalem, made the fatal mistake of inviting Rome to mediate. Rome did not mediate. Rome conquered. Pompey entered Jerusalem. He entered the temple. He walked all the way into the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary where, in Jewish tradition, only the high priest was permitted to enter, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. He found it empty. No idols. No treasures. Just silence. Rome was bemused. Rome was also now in charge. The Jewish state that emerged from Roman domination was technically permitted to exist, but it was a client kingdom subject to Roman approval, Roman taxation, and Roman military authority. Eventually, Rome installed its own preferred ruler, a man named Herod, son of an Idumean governor, who would be remembered as Herod the Great. Herod was brilliant, ruthless, and profoundly paranoid. He expanded and beautified the temple in Jerusalem to a degree that left even skeptics breathless. Ancient sources suggest it was among the most magnificent buildings in the Roman Empire. He also executed members of his own family when he suspected them of disloyalty. Under Roman rule, the Jewish people seethed. Tax collectors bled them. Foreign soldiers occupied their land. Their religious institutions were compromised by political corruption. The high priesthood was no longer an earned spiritual position. It was a political prize. And still, as far as anyone could tell, the silence continued. No prophet rose to interpret events. No divine word arrived to make sense of the suffering. Just the grinding weight of occupation, and the long, aching memory of a voice that used to speak. It would be a mistake to assume that the silent years produced spiritual passivity. Quite the opposite. The absence of prophecy appears to have generated a kind of spiritual explosion, a proliferation of ideas, movements, texts, and factions that transformed Judaism in ways that would echo through centuries of history. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in caves near Qumran, beginning in 1947, contain the writings of a Jewish community that lived in intense expectation of the end of the age. Their texts describe a final cosmic war between the forces of light and darkness, a coming messianic figure, a divine judgment that would vindicate the righteous and destroy everything corrupt. Other Jewish movements developed along equally distinct lines. The Pharisees were devoted to the meticulous application of Torah law to every dimension of daily life. They believed that Israel's suffering was the result of insufficient obedience, that if the people could achieve complete devotion to the divine commandments, redemption would come. The Sadducees represented the priestly aristocracy, politically accommodating toward Rome, skeptical of oral religious tradition, representing an establishment threatened by populist spiritual energy. The Zealots believed that active armed resistance to Roman occupation was a religious obligation, that God would not act until the people demonstrated their willingness to fight. And throughout this entire period, messianic expectation ran at a near constant fever pitch. Ancient sources record numerous figures who claimed, or who others claimed to be the anointed deliverer Israel had been promised. None of them were what anyone expected. Most of them died violently, and the silence held. This is the question that theologians, historians, and ordinary people have wrestled with for 2,000 years. Why? If the God of the Hebrew Scriptures was real and present the being who had spoken through Moses and Isaiah and Jeremiah, why 400 years of silence? Why, at the precise moment when the Jewish people were most desperate and most brutalized, did no prophetic voice come? Some Jewish theologians, ancient and modern, suggest that the silence itself carried meaning. The prophets had warned Israel repeatedly. Departure from the covenant would bring consequences. Perhaps the silence was not absence, but the natural result of a relationship that had been strained from the human side. Not abandonment, but a grief too deep for words. Biblical scholars who approach the question theologically often suggest that the silent years served a preparatory function, that something was being arranged, slowly and invisibly, that required centuries of historical development before it could emerge. The spread of Greek as a common language across the known world. The infrastructure of Roman roads and administrative order connecting cities across the empire. The diaspora communities of Jewish people scattered across the Mediterranean, who would later serve as entry points for a new message to travel rapidly across the ancient world. In this reading, the silence was not emptiness. It was gestation. Others take a more historical approach. They note that prophetic voices in the ancient world were never as continuous as a casual reading of the scriptures might suggest. The great Hebrew prophets were exceptional figures, often separated from each other by decades or centuries. What the intertestamental period represented, in this view, was not an unusual divine withdrawal, but the natural close of one historical phase of spiritual communication. And then there is a third way of reading the silence, one that extends beyond the ancient world entirely. Every tradition that believes in a personal God has to grapple with silence, with the prayer that receives no answer, with the tragedy that receives no explanation, with the years that pass without any discernible sign that anyone is listening. The 400 years of the intertestamental period are not merely ancient history. They are the story of every human being who has ever waited for something that did not come when expected. Every person who has prayed in the dark and heard nothing. Every generation that inherited promises it could not see fulfilled. The question those 400 years raise is not only a theological question, it is a human one. By the final decades before the Common Era, the Jewish world is exhausted. There is no other word for it. 400 years of silence. 400 years of foreign domination, interrupted by the brief, brilliant flash of Maccabean independence, then extinguished again by Rome. 400 years without a prophet, without a miracle recorded in any canonical text, without a divine word that anyone could point to and say there, that is God speaking to us. Again, the people are still waiting. They have always been waiting. But now the waiting has a quality of desperation to it, a fraying at the edges, as though the rope by which an entire civilization is hanging has been stretched too long and too thin. Apocalyptic texts multiply. Community after community organizes itself around the conviction that the end of the age is imminent, that the final confrontation between good and evil is just around the corner, that the long night is almost over. And then, almost without warning, something changes. His name was John. He appeared in the wilderness of Judea in the region around the Jordan River, sometime around 28 or 29 of the Common Era. He was the son of a priest named Zechariah. He wore clothing of camel's hair and ate locusts and wild honey, a deliberate echo of the prophet Elijah, who had dressed the same way centuries before. And he was preaching. Not quietly. Not privately. Not in the careful institutional language of the temple establishment. He stood in the open air by the river and called out to anyone who would come. He announced that the time of waiting was ending. He called the people to repentance. He baptized those who responded in the waters of the Jordan River. The last canonical prophet had spoken roughly 400 years earlier. What John was doing would have been, to any observant Jewish person of the first century, electrifying. The Gospels record that crowds came from Jerusalem, from all Judea, from all the region around the Jordan to hear him. When the religious authorities sent representatives to question him, John was direct. "Are you the Messiah?" they asked. "No." "Are you Elijah?" "No." "Are you the prophet Moses promised?" "No." "Then who are you?" John's answer drew from the prophet Isaiah. "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord." He was not the end of the silence. He was the announcement that the silence was ending. And then, one day, a man came down from Galilee, a carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus, and waded into the Jordan River to be baptized by John. What happened next, according to the Gospel accounts, was the first recorded divine communication since Malachi. A voice from heaven. A descending dove. And words that broke 400 years of silence open like dawn breaking over a desert that had been dark for a very long time. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The silence was over. Here is the question that the silent years leave us with, and it is not a comfortable one. Was God actually silent during those 400 years? The people living through them believed or feared that the answer was yes. 4 centuries of suffering, of foreign domination, of messianic disappointment. It was almost impossible to feel the presence of the divine in any of it. And yet consider what happened during those 400 years in purely historical terms. The Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, making the story and teaching of Israel accessible to the entire Hellenistic world for the first time. A network of Jewish communities was distributed across the known world in Alexandria, in Rome, in Antioch, in Ephesus, in Corinth, each maintaining a gathering place where the scriptures were read and discussed, and where curious outsiders were welcome. The Roman Empire built the roads, the sea lanes, and the administrative infrastructure that allowed ideas to travel faster than at any previous point in history. And the Greek language spread by Alexander's armies 3 centuries earlier had become a tool of almost miraculous communicative reach, allowing nuanced ideas to be expressed in a single tongue to readers across the entire known world. It is as though, seen from a great enough distance, a stage was being set. Every element that would be needed for a message to travel from a remote corner of the Roman Empire to the entire known world rapidly, in a single generation, was put into place, step by step, across 4 centuries of apparent silence. Biblical scholars, who take a theological view, often suggest this is not coincidence. That what looks like absence from the ground level from the perspective of a people suffering and waiting and hearing nothing looks entirely different from a greater altitude. That the silence was not absence but arrangement. Not abandonment but preparation. Others, historians and skeptics who do not share the theological framework, will read the same facts differently. They will see not divine preparation, but the ordinary machinery of history. Empires rising and falling. Cultures spreading and mingling. Ideas moving through human networks, the way ideas always have. Both readings are possible. What neither can dispute is this. The 400 years of silence produced one of the most consequential transitions in human history. The world that emerged from them, built on Roman infrastructure, Greek language, Jewish diaspora communities, and apocalyptic expectation, became the world in which the teachings of a Galilean carpenter spread, within a few decades, from a small province in the Eastern Empire to Rome itself. Whether that was planned from outside history, or emerged from within it, or some combination of the two, that is the question that has occupied the greatest minds of the Western world for 2,000 years, and it has not been settled. What we can say with confidence is this: silence is not the same thing as absence. And 400 years of waiting, however agonizing, however disorienting, however close to breaking faith altogether, is not necessarily proof that no one is listening. Sometimes the most important things happening are the things we cannot yet see. The slow accumulation of forces not yet visible. The gestation of something too large to announce before it is ready. The ancient Israelites had a word for the posture that persists through silence, through the long years when no answer comes, when the promises feel impossibly distant, when the darkness refuses to lift. It is the same word that runs through the Psalms, through the prophets, through every prayer ever uttered into an apparently empty sky. The word is faith. Not certainty. Not proof. Not the comfortable reassurance of a voice that answers promptly and clearly. Just the stubborn, difficult, sometimes agonizing conviction that silence is not the end of the story. And that the voice, when it finally comes, will have been worth every year of waiting.